Greetings, y'all. Shiro Fujioka, aka Voltage Controller, back with another signal versus noise. And I'm pleased to say we are at episode number 7. So thank you very much for giving me, the space to expand the channel and be a little more human. Like, I always wanted my channel to be more human based and not just focused on, the music and not just focused on the instruments and the techniques and all the technical stuff. We have to remember that, we put our heart and soul into these machines. These machines don't do anything without us. So, let's focus on us sometimes and celebrate the humans behind the machines. And with that said, though, let's talk about the machines in this episode of Signal versus Noise. I'm a living contradiction. A lot of people say that gear doesn't matter, and technically that's true. But you can make great music on almost anything, at the end of the day, especially where we're at now. I've seen people rock live beat sets on phones, and iPads, and we got laptops, and we have, dedicated machines. But that's not the real conversation, because the tools just, they don't just affect what you make, but they also affect how we think. How you experiment, how you solve problems, and how long you stay curious. So that's the difference between signal and noise. Noise says gear is gear, instruments are just instruments. But when you get into the signal understands that your tools reveal your personality. So if you really look deeper into the subject, every instrument has psychology built into it. A linear DAW encourages one type of thinking. You have infinite tracks, infinite undos, infinite possibilities. But sometimes, infinite possibilities creates infinite hesitation. You'll spend more time, tweaking and rearranging and second guessing. And before you know it, you spent the last, 5-6 hours organizing sounds and going through plugins and, tweaking compression ratios and all the other things that we do instead of actually making music. So now let's, compare that to something like, Elektron machines or, MPCs or any fixed architecture synthesizer. Totally different psychology. It's constraint-based, and you got limited tracks, you have performance interaction and commitment. So the machine almost pushes you towards, rhythm, experimentation, and movement. And you stop thinking like an editor and you start thinking like a performer. So you're making totally different decisions and you're in a totally different mindset. And that changes, that really changes the energy that you put into the music. And that's also why modular synthesis, that attracts certain personalities. Some people look at the modular system and see total chaos, total confusion, and want nothing to do with it. While others, they see it as like more of a living organism, a sonic conversation and a puzzle. It's like a whole frequency ecosystem, because the modular really isn't about convenience. It's quite the opposite. Especially if you come from a background of using DAWs. Like, I used to use Reason and Logic a lot, and I got into modular from there, and it became more about discovery, happy accidents, unpredictability, and listening deeper. So the instrument forces you to slow down and interact differently. And over time, that interaction shapes your artistic identity. I totally shifted as an artist when I got into modular. I was on an MPC making boom bap, and on Reason and Ableton making boom bap. And that's why I don't really believe in the idea of the tool, being neutral, because they really aren't. Interfaces shape behavior. Workflows shape behavior, and even the limitations in these instruments shape the behavior and the approach. And behavior repeated long enough, that becomes, your style and your sonic signature. And that's why two people can own the exact same gear and not sound alike. Or, someone can come over to my studio and use my modular, and it's not going to sound like anything I make because they approach it differently. and it will sound completely differently even on the same instruments because the personality enters the machine. And honestly, I think one of the biggest mistakes happening right now in music culture is people trying to just copy workflows instead of developing perspective. Everybody wants the exact, method that you use, but, the exact settings or the exact plugin or whatever. But those things alone really don't create our identity. Our perspective on how we use those things is what does that, and taste does that, and life experience does that. So the tool is just translating the person using it. So that's why I always say it's always more important to be a deeper, like well-rounded person and take that and put that into the music. And that's why I've never really been interested in making a lot of tutorials designed, to make people approach things exactly the way I do. That's not the goal, and that's not even how I learn. So it's not going to be how I teach. I'm not trying to create clones. I'm trying to inspire. And I'd rather help artists develop their own sonic signature, and their own relationship with sound, and their own way of thinking creatively. So when I do one-on-one sessions, I'm not teaching people, here's my exact workflow, copy this. I like to share building blocks, and I give you like these little chunks of building blocks, sonic building blocks, and, like Legos, you can take those and make whatever you want with it, based on your way of thinking. But it does, spark the imagination and get you to think a little differently, to approaches to rhythm, texture, arrangement, sound design, and performance. And that's what you can apply in your own unique way. It's not giving you like a paint by numbers kind of situation. So, that's how I like, people to learn on the instruments that they feel drawn to, because the real goal isn't imitation, it's translation. And it's about taking your personality and your experiences and your taste and translating that into sound. So at the end of the day, your setup is so much more than equipment, and it's really an extension of your psychology, your rituals, your curiosity, and your personality. The more of our personality we put in our music, the more it becomes ours. And when you finally find the tools that resonate with the way that your mind naturally works, that's when the signal gets stronger. That's when the signal gets amplified. And every artist, if you give yourself the time, you'll reach that point, and it's ever evolving. So, yeah, I hope this finds you well, and we'll be back with more. And remember, be free through frequency. Peace.